Alright guys, so we're going to do our last set of notes in the evolution unit. And so far we've looked at microevolution, those small changes in the allele frequencies of populations. And remember that those microevolutionary mechanisms are things like natural selection and genetic drift and gene flow, and then just random mutation. And then the last set of notes we focused on the macroevolution, which are those bigger changes. And essentially macro is speciation, where we see one species diverging into two. It's based on like reproductive isolation, and that could be due to things like isolation, where they're divided by some kind of geologic structure or geographic isolation, or it could be something like different food sources or mating behaviors or things like that. And so this last set of notes for evolution is going to be about phylogeny primarily. And through phylogeny, we can kind of look at the diversity of life and how the diversity of life evolved over time. Now, I know that there are components to this that are going to be conflicting, because this does kind of go along with the whole macroevolution idea. And remember, you can take it or leave it. No one's trying to tell you what to believe, but this is the biology explanation. And according to evolutionary biologists, all life evolved from a common ancestor billions of years ago. And if you looked at that geologic time scale, it's believed that the first living cells were about 3.5 billion years ago. And then from prokaryotes, they evolved the ability to photosynthesize, and that led to the ability to do cellular respiration. And then from the prokaryotes, you get your kind of less complex eukaryotes, like single-celled protists, on through all of the eukaryotic groups. Now, once again, I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. You do not have to believe this is how all living things were put on Earth. That is a personal decision that you make. But on the biology aspect, what we do is we study phylogeny, which is the evolutionary history of these species. Because if, according to biology, all life evolved from a common ancestor, phylogeny kind of studies where and when and what are the ancestors and where did they diverge. And so what we're studying here is the evolutionary history of the species, which definitely only kind of fits to that biology aspect. Now, in order to reconstruct phylogeny, what they do is they use a field called systematics. And so they classify organisms not just based on what they look like, but those relationships, like how closely related are they or how distantly related are they. And so our whole lesson today is going to focus on these evolutionary relationships. Now, how do they gather evidence? This is kind of the same stuff that we saw with just evidence for evolution in general, but how do they determine where two species diverged or when they diverged? Well, they study things like the fossil record. Remember that they can kind of get a general idea of how old fossils are. They can look at continental drift. Remember, that helps to explain why certain species are on different continents, or why they may have been together when the continents were together, but now they're apart because the continents have divided. We can also look at those mass extinctions, and this is something else that you may have seen on that geologic time scale, is that normally after a mass extinction you had a lot of diversification. Like there's something called like explosions, where all of a sudden the diversity just went crazy. And because if a lot of the organisms die out, it opens up those niches for the remaining organisms. And so there's believed to be 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history. And so a lot of times there were some patterns that came about after those mass extinctions of diversification. Now, these two are used very heavily. Okay, so you have those anatomical structures. Now, morphology is your body plan, which a lot of times just pretty much boils down to the anatomy or anatomical structures. And so it's very important that you understand that when we're doing phylogeny, we have to be studying structures that are homologous, because homologous structures are similar because they are related. You have to be a little bit careful basing on looks, because looks can be very deceiving. Just because two things look alike doesn't mean they're very closely related. And a prime example of that is the shark and the dolphin. They have very similar body plans, they have very similar coloration, but that dolphin is more closely related to you than it is the shark. And so what you have to look at are not those analogous structures that are alike due to convergent evolution, but you have to look at homologies. And those are the things that are similar because they have a common ancestor. And the data that's used more than anything in today's studies is molecular data. This is comparing DNA sequences, protein sequences, and looking at the differences there. A lot of your phylogenetic studies are looking at the DNA and looking at those proteins. And that is something that, we can compare, and it's not like looking at those external characteristics, okay? We can look at those sequences and we can count the differences, and that's going to tell us how alike two things are. And so the more the DNA sequences have in common, the more closely those species must be. And so what your phylogenists do, or your biologists do, who are kind of studying phylogeny, is they create these phylogenetic trees. It's kind of like a family tree, but it's representing evolutionary history. And so it shows that divergence. Remember that divergent evolution was when two things became more different, and that led to that speciation. And so what we'll see on these phylogenetic trees are just these branches from a common ancestor and branching into new species. Now sometimes you'll see new traits that arise over time, things like an opposable thumb or wings or fins. And so it could be a new trait has emerged and that group has it and the previous groups didn't. And we can kind of use that fossil record to help recreate these timelines. And the sequence of our branching does represent chronology. And so if you don't know what this word means, chrono means time. So it kind of gives us a timing. It's not going to be specific, but it can kind of give us a general sequence of events based on history. So here's several examples of phylogenetic trees. So you can see that sometimes they're kind of triangular like this one, and the branches just come straight off a line, or sometimes they have branches that branch and branch and branch. And so there's all different ways that you can draw a phylogenetic tree, but all of them are essentially showing the same thing. So how do you go about reading a phylogenetic tree? Well, there's a few parts that you might want to be familiar with. There's the root. And not all phylogenetic trees are rooted, but those that have this ancestor that everything descended from, that would be a rooted phylogenetic tree. So it's the common ancestor that gave rise to everything in the phylogenetic tree. And then a node is a branch point. So every place where you see a division, every time where you see a split, that is going to be a node. Okay, so there's a node, there's a node. And what the nodes represent are the common ancestors. So as these nodes, they branch off, and so if you have two groups that came from the same ancestor, those are called sister taxa. And the way we read it is this would be the older times, and this is moving toward the newer times. Same thing here. This would be the past, and this is moving to the present. And so the length of the line usually represents time. It's probably not a specific amount, but it kind of generally shows you of these are more recent, that's further back. And then the closer the node, the more related they are. So like A and B are more related to each other than B or C, because B and C go back to this node, whereas A and B have a closer node. So we can use that to look at which ones are more closely related and which ones are less closely related. And so kind of within the phylogeny studies is a branch called cladistics. And this is where we put organisms into clades, or groups that are closely related to each other. And the clades are in the phylogenetic tree. In fact, sometimes your phylogenetic trees are called cladograms. And they're essentially showing the same thing. They're showing the branching points. They're showing these two are more related than other two. But the clades are groups that have similarities. And so the clades can be nested. I'm going to show you a picture here in just a second. But pretty much a clade is an ancestor and its descendants. And so clades are going to have similar characteristics. They could have an ancestral characteristic, which is something that all of them have, like a vertebrate. Everything in this clade would have a backbone. Or they could be derived characters where they're specific to only certain groups. So a derived character could be something like hair. Only mammals have hair. Or it could be something like lungs. Only terrestrial certain organisms have lungs. And so when we're looking at cladograms, you can see that they do nest. Like this would be a cladogram. There's the ancestor and its descendants. Here's a bigger cladogram, ancestor and all of its descendants. This whole thing could be a clade. Okay, so there's a clade, there's a clade, there's a clade, there's a clade. And so you can see that they do nest within each other. And so organisms in the same clade are going to be more alike. And so they can go from a smaller clade into a bigger clade. And so you see this little node here. Everything in this clade here would have that trait. But only these in this clade would have trait number 5. Okay, so you see it kind of gets more and more specific. Over here's an example of like a cladogram where it shows those shared derived characters. So like a bony skeleton would be a derived character. It'd be something new that came about, and only those that branched off of that ancestor would have it. A hair would be a derived characteristic. An amniotic egg would be a derived characteristic. So the vertebra would be the common one to everything, and then they're kind of grouping off based on different characteristics. Now there are some limitations to phylogenetic trees. I mean, technically they are hypothetical. The reality is scientifically we're never going to know exactly what happened billions of years ago or even millions of years ago. We can use our data and our hypotheses to kind of recreate these relationships, but they are going to be hypothetical. Okay, we won't know for sure exactly what happened. We also have to be careful because remember those appearances can be deceiving. Just because something looks alike doesn't mean they're related to each other. So we do have to be very careful to use those homologies where they're related, and that's why they have those similarities. Okay, it's because of a relationship, not because of function. And then really when it comes to time, we can see like a general timeline, but we don't know the exact specific lengths of time. So they're going to be kind of relative. We don't know for sure. Now something that the biologists will do is there's a lot of different things you can look at. And there's some activities that students can do where they have to kind of create these relationships. And the thing is not everybody will necessarily create the exact same pattern. Because some people may focus on certain traits more than others. What one person finds important, somebody else may not. And it can actually get kind of crazy. This is one of those things where science is always changing and these relationships can easily change. So if you're trying to recreate these relationships, we tend to follow this principle of parsimony, which is keep it simple. The simplest explanation is going to be the best, okay? This is also known as Occam's razor, to shave off unnecessary complications. So here's kind of a silly little example. If you were to hear hoofbeats, it would be a logical, simpler explanation to assume that there was a horse around than there was a zebra in your backyard. So you just try to keep it simple, and that's the path that they're going to take when recreating these relationships. Now the second half that we're going to take a look at is taxonomy. And this is something that you may remember from freshman year. But every organism that has been discovered on our planet is going to be put into a taxonomic group. And so taxonomy is a branch of science where you name and classify organisms. And this is another branch of biology that is constantly changing and being updated. We see it changing as we learn more about the DNA sequences and comparing those. This was invented by a man named Carolus Linnaeus, and I believe it was back in the 1600s. So it's been around for a very, very long time. And it is an international system. This is something that we use in pretty much every country. And so it's a universal language of classification. It includes a naming system known as binomial nomenclature. And it also involves a hierarchy. So we're going to put organisms into groups from more related and less related. And then we're also going to give them a scientific name. And this way, we're using the same language in every country. So for the hierarchy, what we have is a grouping from the broadest group, which is going to be a domain, all the way down to an individual species, which is going to be the most specific. And so you can see here that a domain is going to include a whole lot of organisms. And then as you go down the hierarchy, we're getting into a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and more defined group, all the way down to an individual species. And we learned in our other evolution notes that a species is a group that interbreeds and produces offspring. The species had the greatest DNA alignment. They're the most similar. And then the next closest relationship would be sharing a genus. And then the next closest relationship after that would be sharing a family. And so, like, for example, we're in the domain Eukarya. Also in that domain are fungi. Also in that domain are plants. And so if you kind of compare me to a mushroom or me to a plant, you probably wouldn't look at us and say we have that much in common. But as we go from domain to kingdom, we're now going to be in kingdom Animalia. So now we're only with the animals. And then as we go down to phylum, we're now in phylum Chordata. And Chordata are pretty much going to be your vertebrates. So those things that have a backbone. And as we go down to class, now we're only with the mammals, those things that have hair and mammary glands. And so you can see that we're getting more and more specific until we get down to a human, okay? This is something that you need to memorize. You should know this by heart. You should be able to recite this. If you don't remember this from freshman year, there are some mnemonic devices that you can use. So the one that I learned when I was in school, which I don't think we had domain, I'm kind of old, but it was kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. There wasn't a domain. But I learned that King Philip came over from Great Spain. I've heard other people say 4 grape soda or 4 great spaghetti. You can do whatever you want to do, but a mnemonic that you can use is I added a D to what I learned, and I say dashing King Philip came over from Great Spain. And so you can use that to at least remember the first letter. And it's important that you know the order, because from the order we can understand relationships. So the lower the level, so as I move down this hierarchy, the lower the level that I share with another organism, the more related I am to it. So I'm more related to something in the same family than I am that's just in the same phylum. Because remember, we're getting more and more specific. So the lower the taxa that you share, and each level is called a taxon, the lower the taxon that you share, the more related you are. So you can't get more related than a species. The next closest relationship would be being in the same genus, and so on. So here's some examples of this classification. So here's a panther. We have the kingdom Animalia. Now we're with vertebrates down to a mammal, carnivora. Some other things that are in carnivora are things like dogs and wolves. Felidae is specifically cats. We have several groups in the genus Panthera, and then this is specifically going to be that type of panther. And then over here you can see the different classifications for humans and chimps and blue whales and snakes. So you can see that they're all in the same kingdom, they're all in the same phylum. But as you go down, like these two would be the most related because they share the lowest group of family. The snake would be most closely related, would be the least closely related of all of these because these 3 are mammals. And so you can kind of interpret relationships based on the levels that they share. All right, so the 3 domains of life, in looking at our classification system, and pretty much what we're going to be doing for the rest of the year is after this, we're going to start looking at this diversity of life. We're going to start going into these domains, and we're going to start looking at different organisms and their characteristics. And so the first group that we're going to take a look at are bacteria. And this is a common word to us, but it's literally domain bacteria, and it includes kingdom bacteria. And these are your common everyday bacteria. And when we get to this unit, we're going to learn more about this, but one of the things that they all have in common, in order to fit in this group, they need to have this substance called peptidoglycan in their cell walls. And so this is what kind of separates this group from this group. So your archaeans are also prokaryotes, but they are what we call extremophiles. They live in extreme environments like really hot or really salty. or like really high pressure. They can live in environments that other living things would never survive in. So they live in these extreme environments, and they do not have that structure in their cell walls. And so notice their kingdom name is also the same. So we have domain bacteria, kingdom bacteria, and domain archaea, kingdom archaea. And then our third domain is eukarya, which is all of your eukaryotes. So all of these are going to have nuclei and membrane-bound organelles in their cells. Hopefully you remember that from earlier in the year. And so everything else is going to be in domain eukarya. That includes kingdom fungi, which are going to be like mushrooms and yeast. It'll be kingdom plantae, your photosynthetic plants. It'll be kingdom animalia like us. And then there used to be a kingdom known as protista. Technically, they now have divided it into multiple kingdoms, but sometimes it'll still show kingdom protista as a kingdom. But essentially, protists are eukaryotes that don't fit somewhere else. A lot of them are unicellular, like amoebas and paramecia. And so these aren't as familiar to students, but they are eukaryotes because they have nuclei. And so here you can see the diversity. Here's your three domains, bacteria and archaea. You can see that they have their own kingdom. What they have in common is they're prokaryotes. And then you have your eukaryotic groups, your protists, plants, fungi, and animals. And this is showing you the same thing down here. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is that naming system. So we've taken a look at the hierarchy and the three major groups called domains. And so the other part of taxonomy is giving each organism a scientific name. Now these sound kind of funny because they are Latinized. When Carolus Linnaeus created this system, Latin was the common language of the time. And so they have maintained this format. And so you kind of see a lot of the ums and the a's and the us's. And so that's why they sound kind of funny, is because it's got Latin prefixes and suffixes and kind of root words. And so the scientific name comes from those bottom two levels, the genus and the species. Remember, these were your two most specific, the two smallest groupings. And so based on the hierarchy and where the organism fits, you take the bottom two categories and that equals their scientific name. Now the way you write it is the genus is capitalized, and then the species is lowercase, and then when you're typing it, it's always in italics. If you were to handwrite these, you would underline it. But they always have the same format. Like you can see here several different examples for plant scientific names. Over here I have Homo sapiens, that's humans. Felis domesticus, that's a house cat. Canis familiaris, that's a dog, like your pet. And Drosophila melanogaster is actually the fruit flies that were studied in genetic studies. So over here, just kind of point out a couple of things. So you see how the onion and garlic are in the same genus? So that tells you that they are fairly closely related. So they're different species, but they're in the same genus. So they do have that close relationship. Same thing with these trees here, in the same genus, So the scientific name can kind of help you. If they share a genus, they're going to be pretty close in their characteristics. And that is going to wrap up our evolution unit. You're going to spend a couple of days maybe doing some practice activities, and then next week you're going to be gearing up for a test. So I hope you guys are doing well, and if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to email me, and I hope you guys have a great day.